Good morning, my friends. I'm so happy to be back with you today. And we are now on part 8 of our series on everyday immortality. And I would like to suggest that you go back and look at the earlier versions of everyday immortality. And if you want to go also check out the videos on the mystery of death and also spiritual solutions for existential anxiety, suffering, and the fear of death, because all these are sequentially thought out in the moment, but still sequentially thought out. So yesterday, or a couple of days ago, I introduced the idea of the genetic code being the divine code of existence. The genetic code, and I explained the connection between DNA, RNA, mitochondria, homeostasis, inflammation, immune function, endocrine function. Basically, what I said yesterday is that DNA is the repository of both the memory of biological evolution, but also because the atoms that make up the DNA, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, etc., come from the crucible of burning stars. In a sense, DNA is the entire record of existence and experience of existence and memory of existence of all sentient beings and their experiences. So your genetic code, which is very unique, even if you were an identical twin, is a record of the history, the memory, the experiences of your ancestors, and theirs, of course, in turn, their ancestors, going back all the way to our animal ancestors, our plant ancestors, our bacterial ancestors, our viral ancestors, to the first organisms that were able to reproduce themselves, chemolitho, autotrophic, hyperthermophiles. So, your genetic code has the memory of all of that. And your genetic code interacts through relationship with the genetic code of other humans, but also other sentient beings. And also, if you eat animals or plants, then your genetic code is influenced, of course, by the genetic code, ultimately, of other sentient beings as well. The reason you can eat a banana or digest it, or have a dish of pork or digest it, or sashimi or digest it, is you have the enzymes to make that food digestible, metabolize it to your own biological processes. And the reason those enzymes work is that they are common ancestries of proteins. So the reason there's overlap between bananas and primates and mosquitoes and fruit flies and mice and you is we share the same DNA. We share many of the same genes. We have different genes, minor variations, but genes are made from the same alphabet, A, T, C, and G. And ultimately, our mitochondria are also the same alphabet. Instead of T, there's U. But these 4 letters, 5 letters, write the whole story of life. And so DNA is a microcosm of the universe. And DNA is a repository of cosmic and biological information. Now, of course, if you look at current theories of evolution, which are mechanistic, Darwinian, they say that evolution is a result of random mutations and natural selection. I do not subscribe to that view, and I've been criticized for that point of view. There are other points of view that actually evolution that there are other points of view which say that evolution may be guided by consciousness, or evolution may be the interaction of species of consciousness, and the species of consciousness express themselves as biological organisms. Others have suggested that evolution is punctuated by quantum leaps of creativity because there are gaps in the fossil record. Yet others have suggested that evolution is a process similar to morphogenesis and differentiation, that we have a common ancestor, and just like a stem cell or a fertilized egg differentiates into all the different cells of your body, the consciousness, which is most fundamental, pure consciousness, pure creativity, pure correlation, pure evolution, pure knowing, pure synchronicity, that differentiates into species of consciousness that have similar genetic codes using the same alphabet, and that these are simultaneous appearances of species, just as there's simultaneous appearance of the organs of the body from the same DNA, or from the same genetic code. The genetic code in the brain cells, in the hair follicles, in the skin cells, in your olfactory receptors, in your auditory receptors, in your fingernails, in your bones, in your liver, in your spleen. It's the same genetic code expressing itself differently. So think of a primal stem cell that has basically all codes and all symbolic representations of all possibilities, and that then differentiates into species-specific codes that are minorly different from each other, but that ultimately differentiate into different biological organisms or species, which are species of consciousness. So you see, there are so many ways of thinking of evolution, and each of us is conditioned to think of it in the way we were educated, or the way we were given insights through our modes of thinking and feeling and knowing. And so what we call regular science is a mode of knowing in waking state of consciousness based on theory, experiment, observation, empirical facts, which looks at everything in a reductionist manner, mechanistic manner, and has no explanation for consciousness whatsoever. So if we change that to consciousness being the ontological primitive, then we see these different explanations for evolution. So why am I going through all this? Is because I recently became fascinated once again by the work of Kazuo Murakami, PhD, who wrote this book, The Divine Code of Life: Awaken Your Genes and Discover Hidden Talents. And I'm reading randomly to you from this book. And Dr. Murakami is a very well-known geneticist. He's now about 84 years old. He's worked with Nobel laureates, trained in the US and Japan. And so he says in his book here, and I'm now going to read something, because what I'm reading is actually very important to what I'm going to propose, how your consciousness can influence genetic activity. So he says in his book, an experiment that I conducted many years ago resulted in scientific evidence corroborating the beneficial impact of emotions on genes. Based on the fact that genes are switched on and off by physical or chemical factors, I propose the hypothesis that mental factors are also involved in switching genes on or off. To be more specific, positive factors such as joy, excitement, belief, prayer, upregulate or activate transcripts of valuable genes, while negative factors such as anxiety, stress, sadness, fear, and pain downregulate or deactivate transcripts of valuable genes. To test my hypothesis, we joined forces with Japan's entertainment business giant Yoshimoto Kogyo Company to study the effects of laughter. One of the things I've recommended during this COVID-19 pandemic is, if you have time, and I hope you do, to watch comedy, to watch funny movies. My favorite movies are Charlie Chaplin. I'm old-fashioned. Bob Hope and Candid Camera. Anything that induces laughter. And so they studied laughter, an indicator of healthy emotions, on gene expression. We specifically focused on how laughter would affect blood glucose levels in people with type 2 diabetes. In our study, we measured test subjects' fasting blood glucose levels, after which they listened to either a humorless lecture on science or a comedy show. Then they were served a meal, after which we tested their postprandial blood sugar. Postprandial means after meals. In the first experiment, those who watched the lecture had a 123 milligrams per deciliter increase in blood glucose levels, while those who watched the comedy show only a 77 milligram per deciliter increase. We repeated the experiment, and once again, those who watched the comedy had a significantly smaller increase in postprandial blood sugar than those who didn't. Laughter, the study showed, had a beneficial effect on blood glucose levels. We found that 23 genes were activated from laughing. In addition, one gene that we identified as being activated by laughter, dopamine D4 receptor, DRD4 gene, is linked to inhibition of the enzyme adenylyl cyclase, which plays a role in increasing blood sugar levels. The result could prove to be useful in maintaining blood glucose levels in patients with diabetes. But the implications went far beyond that. For the first time, it was proven that emotions can flip the genetic switch. These findings were published in the journal Diabetes Care in May 2003, and the journal Psychotherapy and Psychosomatics many years later, and were reported internationally throughout the world. So right now what we've seen is that DNA and its activity responds to emotions, the emotion of laughter. But we also now know that DNA responds to the emotion that we call empathy, love, compassion, joy, everything that connects us to the web of existence, because our DNA is entangled with every other DNA that exists. And this is the entanglement of genetic information that weaves the web of life, or interconnectedness, which we call species, biological species. So this is a very interesting experiment, I think, that you can see. Now, somebody, Hope, says the brain, neuropeptides were stimulated. Very important point. Neuropeptides, dopamine, serotonin, oxytocin, opiates are proteins, peptides. But in order to regulate them or secrete them, you need genetic activity. So you need epigenetic modulation of genes in your brain. So right now, as I'm speaking to, the genes in your frontal cortex are being activated because we're having a seemingly intellectual conversation. But if there's emotional joy in this experience, then the genes in your limbic brain are being activated, on and on. If this conversation of fear, then the genes in your reptilian brain are being activated. And all these genes, of course, are in relationship to other people and their genes. So right now, we are correlating my genetic activity with your genetic activity in your brain, in your emotions, in your midbrain, in your intellectual brain, but also in other parts of the body, because genes don't act by themselves. They act as a group. They act as a system. And there is entanglement of gene activity. And the entanglement of gene activity is right now happening through cyberspace. So right now through cyberspace, I can influence, and you can allow me to influence dopamine secretion, serotonin, opiates, other peptides, but all of that requires gene activity. So it's not the brain that is the command center of mission control. It's not the brain. We think it's the brain, it's the genes. And it's the genes everywhere, not just in the brain, but in your gut, in your microbiome, in your heart, in your other systems like the endocrine system, the immune system. It's all correlated, entangled genetic activity that is ceaseless and now. Genes are not nouns, they are verbs. They're activities, and these activities are as fast as you can think, or even faster than you can think. In fact, it's faster than you can think. Gene activity. It's being modulated. We have other studies that show that during the practice of meditation, genes that cause self-regulation go up 17-fold, genes that cause inflammation go down. And there's no drug that can do that with all the genes working together. But mindfulness, awareness, meditation, mantra practice, self-inquiry, deep breathing, yogasanas, pranayam, and all the other techniques of yoga, including pratyahara, they actually correlate the entangled activity of genes everywhere in your body in the direction of healing and homeostasis, and decrease the genetic activity of inflammation that makes you more susceptible to inflammation, immune compromisation, disease, etc. Okay, so this is one interesting thing that Dr. Murakami said. But elsewhere in the book, he also talks about tears. So, I've always been interested in tears. When people have intense emotion, they become teary. Some people cry with joy, and some people cry with laughter. And so I personally believe that whether you cry with laughter or cry because you are sad, in any case, crying and releasing tears is healthy. I'm sure the tears of laughter maybe are different than the tears of sadness or vulnerability, but it doesn't matter. The tears themselves are an expression of genetic activity, okay? Because the whole activity of tearing up is a result of epigenetic modulation by emotions, and therefore it's a release. And in order for you to be teary-eyed, there has to be emotions, and those emotions have to regulate genetic activity, which includes ultimately metabolic activity, inflammatory markers, endocrine system, neuroendocrine psychomodulation, however you want to phrase it. Psycho, neuroendocrine, immune modulation. Emotions are doing it. The web of relationship is doing it. And we don't even have to be physically close to each other, because the mind and emotions are both embodied and relational and can affect and be entangled with each other even through cyberspace. So tears, whatever the cause, are a result of intense emotions. And intense emotions modulate genetic activity. Similarly, if you get bad news, if somebody says you have cancer, or somebody you love had an automobile accident, or whatever bad news, financial markets crashed, then your blood pressure goes up, your heart rate speeds up, your platelets get sticky, inflammation happens, just because you were emotionally affected by so-called bad news. And that also requires genetic activity. So moment to moment, our emotions are affecting our genetic activity. The more connected we feel through love, compassion, joy, equanimity, inspiration, insight, creativity, vision, joy, and desire to engage in love and action, the genetic activity moves in the direction of healing and homeostasis. The more scary the information or interpretation of the information, genetic activity is downregulated in the direction of inflammation, immune compromisation, and susceptibility to even inflammatory storms, which make every illness more devastating. So I have hopefully created a case for you to show that every activity in the body, brain activity, is governed by genetic on and off signals. But that's true of the endocrine system, that's true of the immune system, that's true of the healing system, that's true of everything that's happening as experience in our consciousness. So I would go a little further and say consciousness controls the on-off switches through emotion, through cognition, through understanding, through perception, through interpretation of perception, and through thought. This is how consciousness operates. The contents of consciousness are cognition, understanding, perception, emotions, and volition. So the fine-tuning of the divine code of life is through emotions and through genetic activity. And these genes are in every cell of our body, but in every cell of the body, they're not only performing unique functions, they're correlating their functions with the genetic activity of every other cell in the body, and ultimately with the activity of the total universe. What's the best way to fine-tune these entangled emotions that in turn affect the activity of our entangled DNA and genetic code? What is the best way? I think the best way is in the simplicity of being. In the simplicity of being, all happens spontaneously. And all is creative in the moment, because fundamental consciousness is also creative intelligence. Fundamental consciousness is also creative intelligence. So in the simplicity of being, and then if we activate in the simplicity of being the feelings of connectivity, love, compassion, joy, empathy, equanimity, and actually anytime we are stressed, we turn our attention from the threatening thought to the empowering emotion and feel the body, you'll see that the sensations in the body change. And when the sensations in the body change, perceptions change, interpretation of perceptions changes, and everything else that we call experience changes. This is how we fine-tune emotions, through being, feeling, reflecting, speaking. Be very careful of what you say, the words you choose, because words can heal and words can destroy. This is what the placebo effect is, the nocebo effect is. It's genetically regulated. Okay, and the genes that regulate that are the intergenic DNA, which used to be called junk DNA. So being, feeling, reflecting, speaking, and then love and action, doing. That's the key to regulating your genes for optimal self-regulation, for homeostasis, for immune modulation, for neuroendocrine modulation, for affecting the microbiome, bidirectional traffic, From your gut to your brain, from your brain to your gut, but also involving every other organ in your body. Ultimately, who's regulating this activity? You are. You are. In every choice that you make consciously, you affect the entire space-time geometry of the universe. Whether it's lifting a hand or performing a song or a musical instrument, we also know that any skill requires what is called long-term potentiation and facilitation of synaptic networks. So long-term, it's referred to as long-term homosynaptic and heterosynaptic potentiation that is use-dependent. So the more you use something, the stronger it gets. When you exercise, your muscles get stronger, the tone of muscles gets stronger. And when you do martial arts, the agility gets stronger. When you do yoga, the correlations get stronger. But all of this requires genetic activity, right? The desire to exercise precedes exercise. So the desire to exercise is also an activity of the total universe. You get it? Because everything is an activity of the total universe. Okay? The desire to heal, the desire for joy, the desire for creativity, the desire for love is the basis of life. When two people fall in love, and then that's the emotion. Okay? Then they engage in an experience that we call the consummation of that love, sexual intercourse or whatever, but it is a modified experience of the emotion that we call love. That results in a fertilized egg, which is the symbolic representation of that love. And then that egg, fertilized egg, differentiates into all the organs of your body, the biological organism that experiences the world. The biological organism and the world, therefore, are a manifestation of genetic activity, which is a manifestation of or symbolic representation of consciousness. Everything that we call consciousness, the contents of consciousness, cognition, perception, volition, emotions. Your emotions don't come from your brain. Your brain activity is regulated by your emotions, which in turn is regulated by genes, which in turn are entangled with other genes, both human and microbial and plant and animal, and every sentient being, in a sense, is being a participant in the regulation of the biosphere. And ultimately, there is only the biosphere. Somebody said, what is the simplicity of being? Simplicity of being is sitting quietly and doing nothing. Right now, I am aware of being, aware of being aware. Ask yourself periodically, am I aware? What am I aware of? Am I aware that I am aware? See what happens. You will begin to reinvent the body by resurrecting your soul. This is what it means to influence the divine code of existence by going within. This is it for today. Lise from Belgium says, thank you. Jenny, thank you. Thank you, everyone, for connecting. Yes, genes are verbs, not nouns. Here's another thing to realize. There are no nouns in the universe. There are only verbs. Nouns are conventions of language, never reflect reality. Never reflect reality. A lot of this material I have covered in a more contemporary way in MetaHuman, but I'm continuing here as well with you. People are asking what is Dr. Murakami's book. It's called The Divine Code of Life, Awaken Your Genes and Discover Hidden Talents. Dr. Murakami is 84 years old, one of the important geneticists of our time. Larry Dossey says the Divine Code of Life is one of the best discussions I've seen on the interplay of genes, environment, and consciousness. It is a devastating argument against genetic determinism and the idea that one's destiny is written in the genome. It captures the majestic and spiritual dimension of the universe without being too religious. I think it turned on a few of my good genes. Of course, it turned on a few of my good genes, and I'm hoping that I turned on a few of your good genes as well. God bless. Thank you. And we will... Anne Borelli says, sit quietly, smile, and know. Yeah. Knowingness is the fundamental activity of consciousness. That knowingness can be a thought, a feeling, a sensation, a perception, an intuition, a creative idea, a vision. But yeah, fundamentally, knowingness is who you are. In that knowingness, there's also love. Love, knowingness, bliss. Sat, Chit, Ananda. Let's make that our mantra today. Sat, Chit, Ananda. Thank you, my friends.